All right, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. I will be screen sharing, so I will not be able to see the chat, but if anyone has a question, I believe Jenny will be monitoring the chat, so she can ask questions for you on your behalf if you put a question in the chat. You're also welcome to unmute yourself at any time and ask any questions that you may have. The session is being recorded, so just keep that in mind, and we will go ahead and get started. I'm gonna exit just real quick. I just want to have everyone introduce yourselves. I'm going to put a Padlet link in the chat. Okay, where'd the chat go? There we are. So this is a website where you can go and just answer some questions. We're going to have more questions later on, but this Padlet is just for introducing ourselves. So I will pull up what it looks like on my end so we can all see each other's responses. So go ahead and just introduce yourselves on here. Let us know, your name, your role at the college, whether you're a teacher of English or whether you are the administrative assistant for a department. Just let us know who you are and also why you're here, why you chose our session. Okay, maybe you can respond to the message I just put up. And as long as you don't log in, it should be anonymous. So if any of you, when we have these questions later on, whenever you respond, you can just not sign in and it will just list you as anonymous. That way you can ask any questions you want because this is a safe space. It is a brave space. It's okay to ask a question that you think might be like worded offensively, because you just don't know how to ask it. That's totally okay. We get that all the time. Feel free to, ask any questions that you have because other people might have those questions as well. So thank you for introducing yourselves, and it is now time for Jenny and I to do the same. So hi everyone, my name is Ariane Reed, my pronouns are he, him. I am the budget technician for the Disabled Students Programs and Services here at Fresno City College. I am also the co-founder and also the president of the Allied Staff and Faculty Association here at the college, which works to support our LGBTQ staff, faculty, and students across campus. I have been a part of the Safe Space program for about 5 years now. When I began co-presenting with Jerry Thurston, who founded this presentation a long time ago. And so I've been working with him for a few years, and I've worked with a few other facilitators since then. And Jenny is our new facilitator. She is with us for the first time, so please be nice and gentle to her. This is her first time presenting, and we are super excited to have her on board. So thank you, Jenny, for being here, and I will let you introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Llewellyn. I'm a communication arts instructor at Fresno City. I've been with the college since 2017, and I'm also a founding member of Allied Staff and Faculty. Connor and Ariane invited me, several years ago now, and I have been the vice president of the organization ever since. And we figured it's high time that the president and vice president start doing this presentation together. I've been an ally of the LGBTQ community for most of my adult life. And so Allied Staff and Faculty is a way that I see for me to be a better advocate for the LGBTQ community and of course our students, staff and faculty at Fresno City. So I'm happy to be here with you all this morning and doing this presentation with Ariane.
Thank you, Jenny. So a lot of questions people have first off is what is the Safe Space Ally program? Well, it's a campus-wide network of employees and also students as well who have taken this training. This training is voluntary and it is required to be at least 2 hours. We actually get to have 2 hours and 45 minutes today, which will help make up for all of the mistakes that happened in the beginning that wasted about 10 minutes that we don't usually waste. But this 2-hour training is just, it's not to make any of us experts or anything. It's really just to make us more understanding of how to be inclusive of LGBTQ students, understanding their identities and how we can help make this environment a safer place for them. People who have taken this program that you are in right now will have learned effective allyship strategies, and you'll also receive some resources. I will attach the resources later on during the presentation in the chat so that anyone coming in super late will see those as well. And you'll be using those resources to really help support the students and other people on our campus who are LGBTQ. And if you want to have the highly coveted safe space sticker that you might have seen on some people's offices or office doors, you just need to fill out the ally agreement, which basically just means that you're going to be a cool person to people who are LGBTQ. You promise not to be, you know, outright homophobic or transphobic to our students, etc. And then once you send that back to us, it's just a Adobe document. You'll sign it, send it back to us. Then we can send you our safe space sticker. And we can also send you safe space posters as well. If any of you would like a poster for your area, I've got a couple different sizes. All you have to do is let me know. It's free. I just throw it in your mailbox and you can hang it up wherever you want. And if someone tears it down, you just let me know and I can send you another one. And then some people will ask, why do we even have a safe space program? You know, why do we need one? Well, first off, the Fresno area and also just the Central Valley at large has always rated consistently below average on the Human Rights Campaign's Municipal Equality Index. And what that is it's a report that they issue every year after going around and looking at your city, what kind of support systems are in place specifically for people who are LGBTQ, since people who are LGBTQ face unique concerns and experiences. And so they basically just look at, you know, our laws, our ordinances, whether the businesses offer inclusive health insurance packages to all employees or only those who are not LGBTQ. You know, they try to see how affirming or, you know, not affirming we are. And just rating as average just means that it's not like a horrible place to live. You know, it's not too discriminatory, but it could also really do a lot to improve. So to rate below average is pretty bad. And there's only been 1 year in the last decade or so that they've been analyzing Fresno that we ever even reached average. There was 1 year where we just reached it. And then every other year we've just been well below. Also, an estimated about 4% of the total population, that means all ages, all demographics, is LGBTQ. But if you look at certain generations, for instance, millennials, so people my age, you know, people Jenny's age, about 20% of us identify as LGBTQ. And if you look at the even younger generation, like Generation Z, which is probably going to be a good number of your students, if not now, then pretty soon, a lot of them identify as LGBTQ, about a quarter of them. And also, according to the Campus Pride Index, Fresno City College scored a 2 out of 5. And what that index is it's a survey that we filled out where we let them know, they asked us, you know, do you have this? Do you have that? You know, do you have, you know, inclusive restrooms? Do you have inclusive health insurance packages for your employees? Do you have this? Do you have that? So it asked us tons of questions, literally thousands of questions. We responded, sent that back in. They gave us a score of well below average, which is not surprising because Fresno State also scored a 2 out of 5 as well, which just lets us know that we have a long way to go and also lets us know of a ton of areas in which we need to improve. And I will turn it over to Jenny.
Okay, so we're going to broaden this out just a little bit. What you're looking at is a map of the world and how safe or unsafe it is to be LGBTQ identifying or queer identifying. And taking a look at the left-hand side, so for North and South America, you might think, well, it's not illegal to be queer identifying, so it's overall pretty safe to be LGBTQ in these regions of the world. In the pink sections, it's punishable by death, it's criminalized in the pink areas and punishable by death in the red areas. And so what we want to ask you to consider is folks who may be traveling outside of the US or North or South America for work purposes have to consider how safe it is for them and for their families to also travel to those regions of the world. So that could be for business or pleasure, but it's something that they have to take into consideration. This is just to broaden things out. We're gonna go ahead to the next slide, Ariane. This is a map of employment non-discrimination laws in the US. And you can see in those flyover states, really, there are no protections in the workplace for queer identifying individuals. And so again, this is something that queer identifying individuals need to consider when they're applying for jobs in these states. And there is explicit prohibition for discrimination in the state of California, but that's only with sexual orientation and gender identity. We're going to learn that this is just a small part of LGBTQ identifying folks. So you can see that not all states offer these protections for all individuals. Next slide. And bringing it in a lot closer to home, this is a snapshot of something that happened just within the last few years. A Fresno student was attacked on her Sweet 16, and she was called gay slurs, and this was fairly recent, and this could be someone who is the folks who attacked her could be our students. And this is only 4 years ago. So it's just to bring this a little bit closer to home that these issues do affect our students and queer identifying folks in our own community. This is a snapshot of something that happened on our campus. So you can see that it was a request to stop locking a bathroom on our campus, and there's some reasons why. And you can see some people crossed out, people who are transgender or genderqueer, and you can see that there are some really dehumanizing comments. What even is that? And so this is just to bring it really close to home that these issues do impact our campus culture.
And I'm including some snapshots, little screenshots from the latest Trevor national survey. If you haven't heard of Trevor, they are a national hotline for specifically for people who are LGBTQ, because as you can see here on the slide, people who are LGBTQ are devastatingly affected by suicidal ideation and depression, and also generalized anxiety disorder. People, especially people who are trans, like myself, are far more likely than a person who is cisgender to experience, depression, anxiety, the need to self-harm, and the need to consider or even plan and attempt suicide. Several times greater than people who are not LGBTQ. But just because we have such a high correlation with those behaviors does not mean that being LGBTQ is the same thing as being suicidal. The reason why we have extremely high rates of suicide is because the majority of LGBTQ youth say that someone has tried to change them, try to talk them out of being who they are. And a third of us have reported having been threatened or harmed at some point in our lifetime. And the people who responded to the survey, because again, these are still screenshots from the survey, they're under the age of 24. So by the age of 24, they've already been physically threatened or harmed at least once in their lifetime because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And when you think about it, isolation, being, because a lot of us we're often isolated from other students, especially trans people. A lot of people, they think that it's up to them to figure out like which sports team a trans person should participate on, or which dormitory room we should stay in. And sometimes they can't make that decision. And instead of asking us, they just isolate us from everyone else. And are like, here's your own room, or you can't play sports. And so being isolated and also feeling alienated, feeling like other people don't understand us. They want us to change. They can't just accept us for who we are. All those things, when they're combined, they tend to lead to suicide ideation. So it's not because there's anything wrong with us. It's because of how we're being treated and because of our environment that is leading to these high rates of depression, anxiety, and feeling like we just don't belong in this world. And so we're going to break it down for you real quick, because I just threw some terms at you that you may not have heard of before. And so before we get into all that terminology, I'm first going to let you know, kind of break it down for you so that when you hear these terms, you know what we're talking about. So when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about a person's identity, how they identify, who they are. It has nothing to do with your body, or like what you wear. It's simply that feeling inside that you are a man, or that you are a woman, or that you are neither of those things, or that you are both of those things, or that you are somewhere in between man and woman, or that you're kind of a man, but also just kind of don't really feel like you even have a gender, or, it can mean so many different things. But that's just who you are. So when we talk about gender identity, that's what we're talking about. But when we talk about gender expression, that's going to be how you express your gender. Okay, so that's going to be whether you tend to wear unisex clothes, or whether you like to wear very masculine clothes or very feminine clothes, or whether it can also talk about, it can also be in reference to your posture, the way you walk, the way you talk, whether or not you wear jewelry or makeup, things like that. It can mean so many different things. It's just how you express yourself, and it doesn't have to match your gender identity. And also there's biological sex, which is the physical attributes of your body. So it can be in reference to whether you were born with a penis or vagina, or something that, a combination of male and female genitals, or neither, or some people are born literally with no genitals, or reproductive organs. Some people are born with both male and female organs, or organs that don't reflect either the male or female, usually are more reflective of something like in between. There's so many different ways that people are born, and so many different even like chromosomal compositions that you can have. Most people have XX or XY, but some people have XO, which means that they have one chromosome, and then the other one is partially or completely absent. Or sometimes people are born with an extra chromosome. There's just so many different ways that people can be, could just happen to be born. And it's not like any of us chose these things. We just happen to be born with these gender identities. I just happen to love metal music. Like, it wasn't like anyone forced me to. I just love it. We can't help it. And then there's also sexual orientation, which is, a lot of people tend to think it's just about, sexual attraction, but it can also be about emotional attraction. It's who you're attracted to, who you're capable of, being physically intimate with, or being emotionally intimate with, and spending the rest of your life with, or, having sex with, etc. So does anyone have any questions on any of these things that I just threw at you before we move on?
Ariane, there was one question that we can come back to later. It was about the single-use restrooms on campus, and I know you have a lot to say about that, but maybe we can come back to it.
Yeah, let's come back to that one. I
Okay.
do have a lot to say on that one.
Yeah.
But do I have any questions about any of these terms that we're working on right now? Not seeing or hearing anything, I will move on. Just feel welcome, like I said earlier, to unmute yourself or ask questions in the chat at any time. I love being interrupted, so please don't be afraid to interrupt me. Also, I want to mention that those lines on this previous chart over here, these are even too simplistic. Like a lot of you probably feel like I just threw so much at you and your mind is just totally blown, but I promise you it's even more complicated than that. Those lines should actually be more like a three-dimensional chart, because there are people who just can't even fall anywhere on those line-based spectrums. So the gender spectrum, the sexual orientation spectrum, all those spectrums really should be represented by something much more intricate, because human beings are just, we're too complex for it to be simplified that way. And so the first term I want to go over, now that we have an idea of what we're talking about, is the term queer. And what this term means is it can be used as an umbrella term for the entire LGBTQ community. So instead of saying LGBTQ, we could be saying queer. But at the same time, it's a term that I caution people who are not queer against using, because this term is often seen as derogatory. It was used to oppress many people. There are people here on our campus who find that term offensive, triggering, because it was used against them. You know, they have personal experience of being bullied and oppressed by people who, you know, called them queer. But the reason why we now use this term, like it's just another term, is the fact that during the ACT UP movement, this term became, we reclaimed this term. And so we basically were like, you know what, we're going to take the power away from homophobic people, and we're going to use this term for ourselves. You know, if we call ourselves queer, then when people call us queer, we're just like, yeah, that is who I am. It doesn't hurt us, you know, because we're already using that term ourselves. So we reclaimed that word, and during that time, that word was a very derogatory word. And so the ACT UP movement used that word to get queer people's attention, to impart information to them about the dangers of HIV, how it's transmitted, and how they can get HIV medication, how they can prevent the spread of HIV, things like that. Because there was a lot of misinformation going around during that time. And so they're trying to get queer people's attention and let them know about all this really important information. And so they use the word queer. They would say like, hey, queers, read this. And, you know, that's like, you know, the big bold words on the flyer. And then it got people's attention and they would read it. So that's how we started using that term. As a community, that's how we reclaim that term. But if you're not a part of the queer community, I really caution against using it. You know, you really need to be like a very demonstrated ally or someone who is queer in order to be able to really use that term without unintentionally offending other people. Otherwise, it's kind of like the N word for the LGBTQ community. It's, you know, we may use it and feel totally fine and comfortable with it among ourselves, but when someone outside our community uses it, we're like, whoa. So just keep that in mind. So it's just like a big overall term. Some people use it in reference to their sexual orientation, but some people, most people consider it to just be like a big umbrella term for all of us. So now we're going to talk about gender identity. And I will turn it over to Jenny.
Okay, so hopefully I'm going to ask you to, oh, Ariane, you skipped ahead a little bit.
Sorry.
So, so I'm going to ask you to remember that genderbread person that Ariane just showed you a couple of slides ago. And hopefully, as we're moving through this presentation and going through these terms, you'll come to understand, if you are being exposed to this for the first time, that these categories can be mutually exclusive. In other words, your sexual orientation, your sex, your gender identity, your gender expression, those do not necessarily influence one another. So your gender identity is how you identify, how you feel, how you choose to express yourself according to cultural norms. So gender is a set of socially constructed roles and behaviors, and it's a choice. So some people don't think it's a choice, but it actually is. It's how you feel in terms of who you are. Your biological sex is assigned at birth, and this is according to your reproductive organs. So whatever your reproductive organs look like, you're assigned either male or female at birth. And again, this doesn't necessarily influence your gender identity, although it can for some people. So go ahead to the next slide, Ariane. The next term we're going to introduce is cisgender. And so this is a person who feels comfortable with their gender identity and their gender expressions. And this is based on their biological sex assigned at birth. So when your sex and gender align, a person is cisgender. When your sex and gender do not align, that person is known as transgender. Next slide. So we hope, again, by the end of this presentation that you come to understand sex, gender, and sexual orientation as really a spectrum for each of those categories. So gender is less of a binary and more of a spectrum. So it's more of a continuum. And hopefully, if you're not already there, you can come to see individuals as having a myriad of identities. And that's what makes us all complex and unique. And we hope that by the end of this presentation, you can see folks as more of a mix of identities.
So let's talk about the word trans. So when you hear the word trans, a lot of people think that that's just a shorthand word for transgender, but it's really a big umbrella term for people who are transgender, but it's also an umbrella term for people who are non-binary. And really what the word trans is implying is that it's people who transgress the cultural norms of being a cisgender man or being a cisgender woman. Because a lot of people, they just assume that cisgender men or women are the only type of people that exist, the only type of people that should exist. But we are the other people who exist as well, and who are often disregarded and forgotten. So trans just means that we are not cisgender. And it can mean a lot of different things, depending on which umbrella you fall under or whether you feel like you are underneath both. And we're going to talk about each of those umbrellas. So under the trans umbrella, we have the word transgender. And the word transgender is just a smaller umbrella for just two different terms. And it basically just refers to anyone who feels that they are that they were born, for instance, assigned a male at birth, but actually identifies as a woman, or vice versa. And keep in mind that the word transgender is just a verb. I'm sorry, it's just a adjective. It's not a verb or a noun. So please do not use it in past tense like transgendered. And please do not use it like a noun as if, like for instance, a transgender. Because transgender is just one of the many things that we are. Like I am not just a transgender person. I am also an artist, a writer, someone who loves pumpkin pie. I've got so many more adjectives to my identity. Transgender is just one of many more. And so what we often think of are people who have transitioned, who have gone through hormones and surgery like myself, and like the people on this slide. But it's important to remember there's also a lot of us who don't transition medically in any way. But here are some of the, more commonly, thought of examples of people who are transgender. So sometimes we refer to ourselves as female to male if we are trans men. Sometimes trans women are referred to as male to female because that's sort of the progress of our transition. We transition from looking biologically female to looking biologically male to match our gender identity, because those things didn't just happen to be matched up when we were born. We had to actually put in work to affirm our true identity. We didn't have the privilege of just being born into a body that matched our identity. And then people who are non-binary are going to be people who do not feel that they are a man or a woman. Whereas people who are transgender, we feel that we are a man or a woman, but that we were, our body just happened to not match. But people who are non-binary, they may have been assigned male or female or intersex at birth, but they just do not fall into the male versus female binary when it comes to their gender identity. They feel that they might be both or neither, or somewhere in between male and female, or some combination, or just neither at all. And so here are some terms. You don't have to memorize any of these, and just keep in mind there's like 100 more terms that are not here on the slide because I wasn't going to put 100 different gender identity terms on the slide, but here are some of the more common ones, and it's just important to remember. It's important to remember that they often, are the way that they sound. So for instance, the term gender fluid is, where your gender is pretty fluid. It changes. It can, it fluctuates. It might fluctuate over the course of hours. It might fluctuate over the course of years. It all really depends on the person. One person who identifies as gender fluid is not going to act or be anything like another person who is gender fluid, because we're all just so unique from each other. Um, and so there's also androgynous, someone who, chooses not to present as male or female, but, it might be someone who's, a tomboy girl or a masculine woman. There's so many different ways to identify as androgynous. Agender, someone who's going to feel like they don't have a gender. That's what the word a in front of it means. It basically means like no gender. So whenever you hear like asexual, it's going to be someone who like doesn't identify, with having sexual orientation. Someone who's agender doesn't identify with a gender identity. They just don't have that. That just isn't present inside of them. Someone who's gender nonconforming may be someone who just feels that they're a man who likes to wear dresses, but they still identify as a man. But because dresses are not commonly worn by people in the United States, they identify as gender nonconforming, because they still identify as a man, but they just really love dresses and makeup and purses. So there's so many different ways to identify, and you cannot tell just by looking at someone which category that they might feel that they fall under. It's up to the individual to identify how they identify and to let you know if that's something that they want you to know about them.
Ariane, before we move
have-
on,
Yes.
there's a question about actually just what you said. So what are some respectful ways to ask someone how they would like to be identified without being offensive or without outing somebody?
So in general, you really don't need to know someone's gender identity. All you need to know is their pronouns, how to refer to them. If for some reason, like you are their doctor or something like that, you need to know like how they identify, if you're their therapist or something, and that's something that you need to discuss, then that's going to be a different circumstance, and then you can ask, okay, and how do you identify? What's your gender identity? But in general, all I can imagine someone in the college setting needing to know is someone's pronouns. And the best way to ask someone for their pronouns is to introduce yours first. So everywhere I go, I say, hi everyone, my name is Ariane Reed and my pronouns are he, him, what's yours? And that prompts them to then respond with their name and pronouns. And if they forget to say their pronouns, if they, are just like, hi, I'm Jenny, then you can say, hi, Jenny, great to meet you. What are your pronouns? To make sure that they give those to you, and if they seem confused, just let them know, I'm just trying to respect your gender identity and just want to make sure I'm using the correct terms for you. Any other questions?
And hopefully, again, by the end of this presentation, we can, if you're not already comfortable introducing yourself with your pronouns, hopefully that's something you can practice. It kind of opens the door for others to also tell you their pronouns, and then it doesn't have to be a thing. You don't have to worry about asking them.
Well said, Jenny. Yeah, it can be difficult to get used to. Like I am trans myself, and it still took me like at least a year, I think, before I was like just, naturally, instinctively saying my pronouns every time I say my name. And now I just do. Like I don't think I ever forget. I forget to do land acknowledgements all the time. I probably forgot to do it today. That's probably going to take me about a year too. But even people who are trans, even we, screw up and forget to say our pronouns or to ask people for theirs. Sometimes we accidentally assume people's pronouns, which is unfortunately very harmful to anyone whose pronouns were assumed incorrectly. Which is why it's really important that everyone, not just people who are trans, but everybody ask for pronouns. It's really important to normalizing not assuming people's pronouns and not offending people. So I don't hear any questions, so we will move on and I will turn it over to Jenny.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is sexual orientation. And this is something that, again, you can't tell somebody's sexual orientation just by looking at them. And this would be an area where it's really not important that you know their sexual orientation unless you are planning to ask them out on a date. That's the only circumstance where I could think of where it is important to know somebody's sexual orientation. And what your sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. This is based on gender identity and expression, and who you're emotionally attracted to. We don't have a slide for heterosexual orientation because I think most of us are really familiar with that. It's if you are male identifying and you are attracted to a female identifying person and vice versa. So with that, we can move on to the next slide. So the first one we're going to discuss is gay identifying individuals. And these are male identifying folks who are attracted to other male identifying individuals. And I forgot to mention on that other slide that this just goes for all sexual orientations. And it's really important to remember also for LGBTQ folks that just because someone identifies as gay, lesbian, bisexual, whatever the case may be, that may not be the most salient part of their identity. Just like if you identify as heterosexual, that is probably or may not be the most salient part of your identity. And so it is important to, again, acknowledge that folks have different parts of their identities that are the most important to them. So if somebody comes out to you as gay, it doesn't mean like that is the only interesting thing about them and that's the only thing they want to talk about. So, okay, you can go back to the that next slide. So again, gay identifying folks, it can also be referred to, this is how some women identify. So women who are attracted to other women may also use the term gay. So just if you hear somebody identify as that, it is also common. Next slide. And the next term we have is lesbian. These are female identifying people who are emotionally and physically attracted to other female identifying folks. So women who are emotionally attracted to other women. Trying to monitor the chat. I don't see any questions about this yet. Okay, so the next one is bisexual. This is someone who is sexually and emotionally attracted to men and women. And oftentimes this attraction is not equally split, so they may have a preference for one gender over the other. But in general, they're attracted to both men and women. And I want to clarify, because this does come up sometimes, that bisexual folks are not attracted to everybody. So if somebody comes out to you as bisexual, it doesn't mean they are attracted to you necessarily. It works the same way with people who are heterosexual. So if you identify as heterosexual, you're probably not attracted to all members of the opposite sex. And it works the same way with all other sexual orientations. So with that, we can move on to pansexual. These are people who are attracted to, or sexually and emotionally attracted to, all or many gender expressions. So they don't necessarily have a preference for one gender expression over the other, or a sexual orientation over the other. But again, this doesn't mean that they are attracted to all people. It just means that they don't necessarily have one gender expression that they're attracted to. So again, if someone comes out to you as pansexual, it doesn't mean they're attracted to you and every other human on the planet.
Thank you, Jenny. I just want to mention real quick that people who are bisexual, just because they might be like have a preference for like one gender over the other, it doesn't mean that they are only attracted to that gender and that they are not capable of having a marriage, and living their entire life with someone who falls within the category that they are usually least, less of the time attracted to. So the preference doesn't, determine who they're capable of spending their entire lives with and devoting themselves to. And also I want to mention that each of these terms, these are just the like most common term definitions that are being you know reinforced by a lot of major LGBTQ organizations and nonprofits, but these are not necessarily how everyone might identify. Some people might identify and use these terms differently, especially within the younger generation. A lot of people within Generation Z are starting to use the term bisexual to just refer to attraction to two different types of people, whether that's, for instance, non-binary people and men or non-binary people and women. They're just using the word bi, which means two, to say that they are attracted to specifically two different genders, but not necessarily using the term in the way that has always been used. And people who are pansexual are also, some people are saying that pansexual actually means that they are attracted to people regardless of gender, and that gender has no meaning to them. It all really depends on the person. One person who identifies with one of these terms might define it very differently from someone else. And so it's not, this presentation is not to make any of us experts on these things. It's just to try to let you know this is what they may be referring to when someone says that I identify as bi or as pan, etc.
Okay, and the next term is the A in LGBTQIA, and that is asexual. So these are folks who do not have any sexual attraction to anyone. And we can complicate this a little bit more. There is a term that I recently came, I think Arian has discussed this with me before, aromantic. And so aromantic people have little or no romantic attraction to others. So you can have aromantic asexual folks or aromantic sexual folks, and you can also have asexual identifying individuals. I believe this is an identity that was kind of fought for to be part of the LGBTQIA alphabet. Because it wasn't recognized at first as a sexual orientation, but it is recognized now. And again, this is just a person who doesn't experience sexual attraction. They are or can be capable of emotional attraction and capable of romantic relationships with others. There's just no sexual attraction there.
All right, with that said, we are going to take about a 10-minute break. I'm going to throw some resources into the chat and we will resume at, let's resume at 9:05. Hi, everyone, welcome back. So I was looking through the chat and there's a lot of things I've missed since the presentation started. And also I want to answer at least one of the items in the chat. So someone mentioned that between generations, there are differences between people's feelings about other words, not just queer, but also words like butch. And yes, that is absolutely the case. Each generation has very different feelings about different terms. If you take the Trans Ally presentation program, which is happening today, I think at 1 p.m. If you are also in that, you'll also learn about the differences between the different terms, like the older term transsexual and the newer term transgender and things like that. Because some of us find some of us in the newer generation find those older terms more offensive because they are terms that came about during a time of ignorance and were terms that don't reflect a lot of the people within the community as accurately as the newer terms do. Terms that were created during times when people were learning more about and having a greater understanding of the complexity of human beings. And so some of us, really like those new terms. Just like some people, in the Native American community, still prefer to be called Indians, while some people prefer to be called, you know, Cherokee or Native American or, you know, something specific or something inclusive. Everyone's got a different preference, and it can differ from one generation to the next and from one person to the next, even within those generations. So it's just important to note that, yeah, people do have different feelings about, you know, what is the most appropriate term, versus which one perpetuates ignorance, versus, you know, this is just how it's always been, so we should just stay the same. Like, everyone's got their own preferences. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And yeah, so someone might find one word offensive while someone else says, no, this is my term, this is what I use for myself, this is what I've always used. And so what I do is if I need to say someone's identity, you know, if they gave me permission to out them and I need to say what their identity is to someone else, and they're using a term that other people might find offensive, then I would say, how I would say is, you know, for instance, you know, John Doe is a self-identifying transsexual man, because transsexual is a term that many people who are transgender would find offensive because it's an older term that perpetuates it. You know, it came from an era of ignorance and kind of can in some ways still perpetuate that ignorance, even though some people now view it as having a different definition. Still, because that term is kind of like iffy, you know, as to whether it's appropriate to use. So I say self-identifying, which lets people know, I'm just letting you know this is how that person identifies, and that I myself may not, you know, use this word in generally, but I'm using it because that's how that person identifies. And the thing is we cannot determine, it's not up to us to say, you know, to change someone's identity, you know, to tell people that they go by a different identity than how they identify, you know, because it's not up to us to say who or what a person is. You know, it's up to that person to determine who they are. They know themselves much better than we do, and they have reasons behind the ways that they feel about things and the reasons why they call themselves this versus that. So it's not up to us to change any of those information. It's just up to us to pass that information along if we have to. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on unless I have any other questions before we go on. Not hearing anything. My remote not working. There we go. We are now going to watch a video that is just a bunch of students just voicing their perspectives and their feelings on certain questions. So it's going to, you know, say what the question was, and it doesn't even have like an interviewer asking questions. It's just students. So it's a really cool video. I never get tired of watching it, even though I've watched it probably like 20 times now. So we're going to step out of this presentation. And I'm going to pull up that video.
Every day struggle and think you might get attacked or something might happen to you just for being who you are.
Especially when I'm nervous and worried about professors misgendering me or using my legal name in the classroom.
And it kind of brought me to a place where I didn't want to speak up and I didn't want to be open anymore.
It's a big box to unpack.
I identify as gender fluid.
Queer or pansexual.
Queer trans man who is also Christian identified and white.
I identify as a dom or masculine of centered.
A trans male.
Pronouns are she, her, or kid, at which I made that up with 2 Ds.
I've chosen masculine for the time being. I'm trying it out.
Poly, pansexual, transsexual.
Gender fluid.
I prefer they, them, their pronouns.
I use he, him, his pronouns.
I am gender fluid.
I identify as a queer, genderqueer, or non-binary trans person.
Her, her, and hers, they, them, and theirs.
I'm genderqueer, pansexual.
It's pansexual, and I'm also a trans man.
A lesbian.
As a gay man.
And I'm a non-binary trans woman of color.
FTM, so I do identify as male, but I am transgender. And then I am also asexual, probably aromantic on that scale.
Preferred gender pronouns are a big thing.
We are constantly worrying about being outed in classrooms, in counselors' offices.
Our school isn't set up so that we have preferred names or preferred pronouns on a roster that a professor gets.
So what do you prefer to be called, or what if you're masculine centered presenting, do you identify as trans or lesbian? Do you have a preferred gender pronoun?
Getting your legal name changed is really hard or expensive to do, and it's really out of my budget. If someone who's trans doesn't email the professor beforehand and say, hey, I know this is what it says on your roster, but actually I prefer this. And so you're essentially coming out every semester.
Before I had my legal name change was that before all the classes I would end up emailing my professors and being like, can you call me this name? Can you use these pronouns?
And if you don't email them beforehand, you have a really awkward situation on your hands when they call roll.
Every day it's scary to just be in class not knowing what people are going to say.
When my professors don't notice that I have a preferred name listed in the university registry, it can be very anxiety inducing to wonder, oh, what's going to happen on that first day of class when I'm outed? What are other students going to say? What is the teacher going to say?
People need to know that if they sign up for certain gym classes, that they will be able to go into the space. It's best for them, and they need a system where people can get preferred names on their ID cards and being able to go into a classroom the first day knowing that your birth name will not be spoken.
My school does not have a preferred name policy, so a lot of times I feel uncomfortable talking to teachers or other students, or even submitting assignments because it's not the name that I identify with.
And some of them respected that and some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't, I immediately just totally checked out of their classes and just sort of did the bare minimum to pass.
There have been classes that I've skipped intentionally because I don't feel safe going.
There have been times where I've offered, I guess, a sort of different perspective on, normal gender role ideas and, that kind of thing, and it was kind of met with big backlash.
Advisors sort of tried to make a safe space, but at the same time, I don't feel comfortable and supported to be myself in those situations. So sometimes when we're dealing with sensitive issues, I have kind of trouble.
A teacher misgendering me, like, oh, good morning, sir. Or, students passing me, what's up, man? Things of that nature. Before I came out as gender fluid, completely misgendered. But when I encompassed the gender fluid, it made it easier for me.
So I felt like I kind of recoiled, and I couldn't thrive, or I couldn't be as successful in that environment as I wanted to be.
There are instances where I feel unsafe, mostly because they're unmonitored or it's just not very populated. And I feel that there is an easy chance for me to be targeted as a trans person.
If it's just a simple thing about using the women's bathroom.
One of our students is a trans female, and she actually was escorted out of one of our bathrooms by a security guard.
As soon as I walk in there, I get stares, and it's hard for me to stare off those stares and, counteract anything that they say or that they do.
So constantly at school, I am forced to think about the necessities of my own well-being versus thinking about my classroom and what I should be studying.
Anybody on the scale of fluidity with their gender, they need to be able to go into the bathroom that they're most comfortable with, and no one should be able to be harassed or removed by security.
I've lived in all women's dorms, and being the only guy in a women's dorm is kind of awkward.
I'm fortunate enough to be able to switch it on and off in a way that I can dress the way I want in safe places and then dress how I need to when I can.
When I am trying to concentrate in class, but I'm trying to also map out how I can get to the restroom while being safe.
There should be family bathrooms for anyone to be able to use the bathroom. We're just going to the bathroom. you know?
There's a lot that needs to go into my campus. A lot of more acceptance.
Housing has not made much progress. I've created an entire proposal.
Always feel uncomfortable in spaces where people start mentioning how they date and they have sex, not because they're being, prejudiced against me, but because it's something I don't understand.
The person that I was communicating with no longer works there, and they haven't filled the position, and they told me just to basically wait until they could fill the position.
I wish HBCUs were more open to supporting or having resources for LGBTQ folk.
Being in the Bible Belt is something that honestly affects me because I am a religious person, but I also support gay rights 100%.
During gender studies, they try to get some of us, me included, that are a part of the LGBTQIA community to sometimes even speak out and try to teach the other students. I feel that this is wrong. Why should we ask students to tell their personal experiences?
It's just ignorance, it's just a lack of information flowing because they don't have a resource center.
Once people leave, it's like as if we were never there. Once the advisors leave that actually direct our community, it dies out. Like nobody's there to pick it up and say, okay, let me just keep on going with this.
One where dialogue is encouraged for sure.
I love enthusiastic professors.
Whenever I'm at a place and I feel safe, I feel at home, I feel like I have no care in the world and I'm only there just for my education. And that's what the whole purpose of going to college is for, right?
Hands-on environment, 100% hands-on. It doesn't really matter who I'm with.
I love something that you have to really investigate and think about.
I love analytical and critical thinking, so once we can open up the floor, we can talk about it, everybody's free to discuss, and we bounce ideas off of each other. That's a great learning environment.
He makes me feel really comfortable about who I am as a person and what I identify as.
I definitely look forward to classes that are inclusive right off the bat. So if a professor goes out of their way to make sure to establish a safe space, to establish an inclusive space, I definitely will look forward to coming back every day and learning what I have to learn in that class.
A safe environment. I know that's cheesy as it sounds, but it's honestly a safe environment is somewhere that I feel excited to learn because I feel like I can actually put my full effort into learning.
An environment where everybody's just kind and loving and accepting.
I mean, when you're just open and you're like, yeah, we got this on the board and we're doing this today, like that brings me out. That makes me feel safe to be who I am.
One particular moment, he was like, well, you have to wear a dress for speech day. I don't wear dresses, so we had to compromise and meet in the medium, and I got to wear a bow tie and slacks. And that's where I kind of got my big urge to speak out more vocally versus standing in the background.
Let people be who they are, let people express how they want to express themselves, and most importantly, do not judge a book by its cover.
I live on campus. I'm actually living in the new gender inclusive learning community at Purdue. It's very small right now, but we're hoping to make it bigger. But I'm really excited about it. It's gonna be pretty awesome. An environment where I feel supported and where I feel like I can grow and be nurtured and be validated in all aspects of my identity. Allowing us to tell you who we are makes us feel safe as students. It makes us feel like we can learn in your classroom. It makes us feel like we can come to class.
Have a peek inside of the way the world works for us and let them know that we are a part and, we're not separate, we're here.
My name is Matt.
English.
Sean.
Kate.
Corinne.
Ms. Alicia Morgan.
Eric.
Nate.
Marta.
Quentin.
Charlize.
Eddie.
Pat.
Ask me.
Ask me.
Ask me.
Or ask me.
All right, so I'll turn it over to you, Jenny.
Okay, so I love that video. I think it really speaks to, especially for instructors, we can't always control how students react in our classrooms, but we can certainly set the tone in our class. And I think that video just really emphasizes that, that you do have a lot of power in your classroom, and you can use it to help students feel safe in their learning environment. So with that, we're going to talk about binarism, and we're going to get into hetero and cis normativity. And the first step with creating an inclusive environment and a safe learning environment for your students, or if you're not in the classroom, a safe space for you to interact with students and also other staff and faculty, is just this awareness that we do live in a very binaristic society. And what this means is that we have this tendency to create these dual categories. And with gender, that tends to happen with the male and female category. And it's not really our fault. I mean, we're saturated in it all the time. And I think one really clear example of this is, this is also very cis normative, but if you go to any toy section of a store, so if you go to Target and you go to the toy section, there's a very clear distinction of what the girls' toy aisle is and what the boys' toy aisle is. It's like pink and blue. I know that some stores are starting to make moves to try to reduce that, but it is really infused in a lot of areas of our culture. And our research, at least speaking from the communication discipline, tends to perpetuate this. So we do often study male and female subjects, and then we report on that, and the research then perpetuates this binaristic thinking. So the first step is just an awareness that not everybody identifies as male or female, and it's not really that important that we try to figure that out in our class or as instructors, that we're constantly acknowledging that that there's not just this binary. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next slide, which addresses normative assumptions. And normativity is really just this set of ideals. It's a standard or way of thinking based on what's considered the correct way of doing or the correct way of being. And so when we say heteronormativity, this is the assumption that all individuals are heterosexual. And there are some clear examples. I think one of the clearest examples, or at least it's just a something I think a lot of us can culturally identify with, is the game of life. And there are a lot of hetero and cis-normative assumptions in that game. So if you've ever played the game of life, it's a board game. You pick a pink or blue playing piece, and in the game you move through these different life milestones, like getting married, buying a car, things like that. But a lot of them are very heteronormative. So getting married, for example. And if you land on that square, you have to get married. And so it is a game, but it really speaks to larger cultural assumptions. So again, heteronormativity is the assumption that that everyone is heterosexual, and I didn't address cisnormativity yet, but that's the assumption that all individuals are cisgender, that their gender identity and expression matches their biological sex. And again, just the first step is awareness and really starting to push against this. And we can talk more about ways to do this in the classroom. My discipline lends itself to a lot of discussion on this, so it does happen kind of naturally. But in my classroom, I'm careful to talk about research in terms of we talk a lot about relationships, and if I'm referring to male and female research subjects, I'm careful to say that that's who was studied, and that of course people identify in various ways, and that the research is really lacking in this area. So there are always opportunities in the classroom to kind of grind against this hetero and cis normativity.
So let's talk about Erasure. And besides being a rock band, Erasure also is the ignoring of the, it is when you ignore the existence of genders and sexual orientations that are in the middle of the spectrum. In other words, when you commit erasure, it's when you forget to, to mention, people who are trans, people who are non-binary, or people who are gay or aromantic or pansexual, bisexual, etc. It's when you're, talking, teaching people about history, and you don't teach them maybe you teach them like all about like all of our 50 white presidents that we've had, but you don't even mention Martin Luther King or Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera or any of those people who are people of color, who are people who are LGBTQ, or if you're teaching history and you're teaching students all about a lot of the famous writers, vast majority of them being cisgender, heterosexual, and white, but you don't mention the few who were not. If you don't mention Audre Lorde or or Baldwin or any of like the many LGBTQ famous writers during that same time period, you may not be doing it intentionally, but that is a form of erasure. It basically, because LGBTQ people have existed since as long as people have existed. As long as humanity has been in existence, there's always been diversity among us. But unfortunately, a lot of people literally think that trans people are a new thing. They don't realize that we've actually always been here. It's just that we've always been silenced. We've always been oppressed. We've always been told to just be more like a girl, be more like a boy, etc. And so we've actually always existed, but people have always, kind of hidden us away. When people teach people about history, they often don't mention us. They don't mention people who are trans, or the people, or they mention, a person's name, say what they did, and never mention that that person was LGBTQ. And that erases our history and makes it seem like we're a brand new thing that just popped up out of nowhere, rather than that we are a type of human being that has always been around, just a little bit more hidden because it wasn't safe for us to be very open and public about ourselves. But we've always been here. So that's what erasure means. And heterosexism is a fairly new term, which just means that it's kind of like heteronormativity, except it's conscious behavior. It is a deliberate belief that everyone is and should be heterosexual, and that heterosexuality is superior to other sexual orientations. And heterosexism it's very dangerous for people who are LGBTQ. For instance, I don't know if many of you have heard about Matthew Shepard, but this is a young man who was killed a few years ago by people who tricked him into thinking that they were cool with him, because he was very, out in public about the fact that he was gay. He did not try to hide it, and some people acted like they were cool with him, and then actually took him out deep out into the country, they on false pretenses, and then turned out to be very heterosexist, and they killed him. And people, when they talk about it, and in the news reports, if you Google it right now, you will see a million headlines that say that Matthew Shepard was killed because he was gay. But what I want to mention is that people are not being killed because they are gay. They are being killed because their murderers were sexual supremacists, because their murderers were heterosexist. Or if a trans person is killed, it's because their murderer was transphobic. It's not because there's anything wrong with us. It's not because of anything that we did. This is supremacy beliefs that are very dangerous for people who are LGBTQ. And transphobia, which I just mentioned a moment ago, it's going to be a reaction of fear, loathing, and discriminatory treatment of people are trans, or people who even just look like they are trans. So this not only affects people who are trans, but even people who might be incorrectly assumed to be trans, just based on the way that they look, the way that they dress, the way that they behave, etc. So it's just, and although it has the word phobia in it, it's not always about fear. It's often also just about hatred. Although I find that hatred and anger and violence often stems from fear. And so anyway, it's that, that hatred, that loathing, that discrimination that people perpetuate against trans people. That is what transphobia is. Jenny, this is your slide.
I know, I was just figuring out how to unmute myself again. So now that we've been talking about all the isms, heterosexism and normativity, like cisnormativity, heteronormativity, we're going to turn it over to privilege. And for some reason, this word privilege can be a little bit triggering for some folks. But as you're listening to this, I would like to encourage you to think of privilege as a way for you to really exercise your allyship and to recognize the power that you may have to help others. So privilege, heterosexual and cisgender privilege are essentially unearned advantages that LGBTQ plus individuals do not have. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are just some examples that we're going to go through and see if any of them sound familiar to you if you are heterosexual and or cisgender. So if you have acceptance and affirmation by your religion, if you're able to use the restroom of your gender identity without fear of harassment or laws that might interfere, if you are able to adopt children jointly with your partner, if you're not afraid of being fired from your job due to sexual orientation or gender identity, if you're able to travel the world with your partner without fear or having to do any extra research about how safe it might be for you to travel there. Being able to seek medical treatment, housing, employment, promotions, opportunities, getting loans or leases, or to make purchases. Then you have heterosexual and or cisgender privilege. Next slide. And I want to emphasize that this is not something to be ashamed of. Having privilege is unearned. So literally you did nothing to have it. It doesn't define who you are. It doesn't define your character, really only actions. And having privilege in these areas is power to disrupt bias. And so you can use your privilege and use your power to speak up for individuals who may not be as comfortable, for you to fight oppression. And it's something that you need to be aware of in order to use and support those, in order to use it to support those who don't have it. And this brings us into allyship. So you have this opportunity to become an ally to the LGBTQIA community. And this is someone who confronts implicit and explicit bias, such as heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, all of the things that we have just defined for you in this presentation. In themselves and in others, because they care about the well-being of LGBTQ identifying folks. And you see heterosexism as a social justice issue. This workshop is for everyone who wants to promote LGBTQ plus inclusion and support LGBTQ plus individuals. So not only on our campus, but in our community at large. So there are stages of being an ally. The first is awareness, which I've mentioned several times throughout this presentation. So exploring how you are similar and different from LGBTQ plus individuals. The second step is knowledge and education. So beyond this presentation, you begin to understand policy, laws, and practices and how they affect LGBTQ plus individuals. So doing some research even outside of this presentation. For example, someone asked a question earlier in this presentation about the single-use restrooms on our campus. That's an ongoing issue on our campus. And so becoming aware of some of these issues that affect folks, not only on our campus, but in our community, that's another step of being an ally. Once you start becoming more comfortable and you have more knowledge about these issues, you can learn to take your awareness and knowledge and communicate it to others, kind of like what we're doing in this presentation right now. So being able to share that in an inclusive way, in a really invitational way, is part of being an ally. And then finally is taking appropriate action to create change in areas that you see fit.
So what can you specifically do as an ally? The number one thing that you can do for us LGBTQ folks is avoid making assumptions. And this is in all regards, but most especially, you cannot tell anything about us just from our appearance. You cannot tell our sexual orientation, you cannot tell our gender identity, what pronouns might make us most comfortable, you really can't tell. A lot of people think that they think that they can just assume things based on people's voices, or whether our bodies look more male or female, whether we're dressed in a feminine or masculine way, but you really can't tell. And a lot of times when people make these assumptions and they try to guess what pronouns to call us, they end up hurting us because they end up choosing the wrong ones and making us feel invalidated as a person. And if a person is LGBTQ, please remember, this does not mean we are attracted to you. I know we've said this before, and unfortunately, as ridiculous as it is, it does need to be said, because I have had so many people in my life say, well, so-and-so wasn't attracted to me, so they must not have been a lesbian. And I was like, what makes you think that you are attractive to every lesbian? Like, are you attracted to every man? No, then, same thing for us. And please use inclusive language. In other words, language that does not assume that we are heterosexual or that we are cisgender. And I'm not just saying, to use this when in circumstances when you're with an LGBTQ person. This is something that you should be doing at all times. An ally isn't an ally at all times. It's not a part-time gig. It's something that we all need to be doing at all times. Otherwise, we're not really an ally. So you should be using inclusive language. For instance, if you are giving hypothetical examples to your students, as a way of demonstrating something, use they, them pronouns for the person in the hypothetical scenario, because that allows that person to potentially be someone who is non-binary. But when you say he/she, or him or her, you're limiting that possibility to only two genders. And you're basically saying that you don't care if non-binary people exist, that you don't recognize us. As far as you're concerned, we're such a minority, we don't deserve to be recognized as much as any other gender. It's sending a lot of bad signals when you do things like that, or when you go to your coworker who looks male, and so you ask them, hey, you have a girlfriend? Again, you're assuming that that person is male, you're assuming that they're heterosexual, and that, and so you're making a lot of assumptions, and there's just so many ways that, we can just screw up and accidentally make like multiple assumptions just on like one question like that. And so just please try to keep in mind your language, try to hear yourself and realize, oh, I just asked that person something based off of like so many different assumptions that, for all I know, could all be wrong. Try to respect our confidentiality. As an ally, if you, for any reason, need to tell someone that I'm trans, I'm actually very out. I'm like totally publicly out, but some people, they're like partially out. Some people are not out at all. So always ask the person, before you out them to someone, just call them up and say, hey, I need to tell someone so that you're trans because of blah, blah, blah. Is that okay with you? Or, should I just omit that information? Always ask us before outing us, because it might be dangerous for us to be out. If you out us, our parents might find out, we might get kicked out of the home. Our partner might find out and divorce us and kick us out of the home. I mean, there's so many different like bad things that can happen to LGBTQ people that other people don't necessarily have to worry about. And as an ally, it's so important that you speak up against anti-LGBTQ comments, even if they come from an LGBTQ person. It's because silence is just often interpreted as consent. So it's just really important that you not be silent when someone who is LGBTQ is being harmed verbally or physically. An ally is also actively an ally. So an ally attends LGBTQ programs like this one. So you're all off to a great start. An ally would also, go to the Pride Festival, display your support to your students, show up on class the first day or every day, with a rainbow bracelet or some other item that indicates that you are an ally. An ally is not worried about, that rainbow bracelet causing people to assume that they are gay, or something else, because an ally knows that being LGBTQ is not wrong. It's not a bad thing to be. It's just a different type of person, and that the only thing that is wrong is people making assumptions. So an ally is not worried about being, mistaken for being an LGBTQ person, but they might want to, recommend that person not make assumptions in the future after correcting them as to their true identity. And if you goof in any way, just apologize. You're not expected to know everything. No one expects no one expects other people to be perfect. Anyone who does probably has some issues going on. So yeah, just apologize, and that is usually, the best way to resolve the situation. And and if it was just like a minor slip up, a quick apology is all that's really needed. We're busy, we got things to do, we got other things we want to talk about, other places to go, things that we need to get done. So it's not like you need to like give us a long-winded apology every time you make some sort of small slip up. Just give us a quick apology. But if you are like just like constantly screwing up, or you made like a huge mistake, then you might want to take more time with your apology. And now I'm going to go over some tips for being an ally to people who are trans specifically. Again, back to like the number one most important thing, which is avoiding assumptions. Please avoid assumptions about whether a person is trans and what a trans person's sexual orientation is, or even what our pronouns are. So just because someone identifies as a man does not guarantee that they are going to identify with he, him pronouns. There are many people who are both transgender and non-binary. In other words, we feel that we identify as a man, but at the same time, we also like don't quite feel like a man. And so we might prefer to go by they, them pronouns, and and may or may not call ourselves a man, even though we might be presenting as male. We might have gone through like hormones and like 7 surgeries to look male, but still actually prefer to be called they, them. People are just so complex, and can really be unexpected when you ask us, something, deeper questions about ourselves. We might not be anything at all what you expect us to be. So please don't make any assumptions about us. And if there's something that you need to know, ask it. But like our pronouns, for instance, I don't think anyone has ever been offended being asked for their pronouns unless there's someone who doesn't understand the importance of not assuming people's pronouns. But trans people, we love it when you ask for our pronouns and our preferred names, and don't just try to assume those things. When you try to assume those things, you're probably going to get it wrong. You're probably going to offend us. And you might even trigger feelings of gender dysphoria, which is the discomfort of being, of having a body that looks different from the gender that we truly are. So please just avoid assumptions. And please use the name or the pronouns and the term that the person self-identifies with. So if a person tells you that their pronouns are they, them, even if it's difficult for you to get used to using those terms, please use those pronouns. And if that person tells you that they are a trans woman and you need to say to someone else, if for some reason you need to relay that information, and you have their permission to do so, then call them a trans woman. Don't call them, a transgender woman or a non-binary woman. Call them what they are, what they told you that they are. And if you don't know, and it's something that you do really need to know, I mean, everyone needs to know each other's pronouns, but if you need to know like their, the term that they identify with or something like that, just make sure you ask that privately. A trans person's real name is our name. So, when we give you a name and, when I tell you that my name is Aryan, trust me, my name is Aryan. When you ask me, well, what's your real name? What you're implying is that Aryan is not my real name, that Aryan, which is the name that represents my identity, who I am, is not real, and that who I am is false or somehow like false or fake or fictional or something like that. And anyone who knows me knows I cannot act if my life depended on it. I don't know how to be fake at all. I'm really, really bad at that stuff. Even though I try role-playing games a lot, I'm just absolutely terrible. And so I just don't even understand how some people can think that my identity isn't real, or that I'm pretending. I honestly have no idea how to pretend. So please just keep in mind, if you need to know our legal name, ask for that. If you're working on a financial aid form or something and you need to know that information, ask us, ask us for our legal name and ask us to write it down, or, to type it in ourselves or something, so that we're not having to say it out loud, especially if there's other people around, because that name probably causes us a lot of discomfort. And then also having to say that that's our legal name, or, the name that was assigned to us at birth, etc., tends to out us. So when I tell people, that my previous legal name was Alana, it really tends to out me as female, because that's a very feminine name. And so just because a person is transgender, it's important to keep in mind that they may not have had any hormones or surgery. Being transgender doesn't mean that you're required to do those things, doesn't mean that you're required to have to feel like you need to do those things. There's so many trans people who are just not comfortable with the idea of medically altering their body in any way. A lot of us, like, we don't even take, ibuprofen for a headache. So, it's really difficult to like make that decision to like go on hormones and things like that. A lot of us also just don't have the financial means to do it. Or we just don't have the privileges to be able to get in there and get it done. One of my Black trans friends has been waiting like 2 years for the same surgery that I had within like 1 year. Even though we had the same insurance and we're going through the exact same channels and everything. Some people just have more privileges than others. But it's important to not assume whether or not we have had it or whether we even want it. And by law, a person who is transgender is legally allowed to use a restroom that we identify with, regardless of how we look or dress or behave. People in California are allowed to use the restroom. Unfortunately, other states, that is not the case. So many of us also feel like, like I, for instance, cannot travel to places like Texas because I legally do not have the right to use the restroom there. And so if I am attacked, I have no way of reporting it. I can try to report it, but no one's going to do anything about it. The report will be thrown away because there's no laws behind that. The laws protect the perpetrators, not the people being victimized, unfortunately. So it's just important to keep in mind that at least here in California, our students, because of Title IX, do have the legal right to use the restroom. And I will turn it over to Jenny.
Okay, I just wanted to, you don't need to go back to the slides, but I was just going to add for allyship, I'm cisgender and heterosexual, and I'm also an ally. And if you're sitting through this presentation and wondering, how do I become this perfect ally? I just want to let you off the hook and tell you there's no such thing as being a perfect ally. And I think it's more important to demonstrate that you're committed to learning and to just being committed to being an ally rather than trying to do things perfectly or say things perfectly all the time. In my experience, I found that when I do goof, like Ariane mentioned earlier, that when I apologize for it, people are generally pretty gracious about it, and they're just ready to move on after that. So I did just want to add that if you're sitting there and like worried about all this terminology, because there is a lot of terminology and getting it exactly right. The point is that you're committed to learning about it, and that you are trying to get it right, but not that you are doing it perfectly all the time. And so now we're going to address how to call out bias and LGBTQ phobia. We're going to present this neat little list to you, but I do want to acknowledge that some of this is easier said than done, and it does take practice over time to be more comfortable with doing some of these. And so I encourage you to take baby steps with some of this. This is part of becoming an ally, is calling out bias when you see it or when you hear it. So first, you can always assume that there is an LGBTQ person in the room with you, or at least someone who cares about LGBTQ people, that there probably are other allies around you. So that's the first thing to know, is that you probably have support around you and others who are kind of like-minded. Can you bring up that next point? So you also want to speak up against offensive comments, even if it is from someone who identifies as LGBTQ. Because silence is often interpreted as consent, as Arian mentioned earlier, it is important to call it out when you hear it or when you see it. There are different ways to do this. So my MO is typically to praise publicly, criticize privately. If you want to take that person aside later, or set up a meeting with someone to discuss something that you found to be biased or homophobic or cisnormative, whatever the case may be, you may want to consider doing that privately, because the goal here is for this to be invitational and for it to come from kind of a loving place that we are trying to do better and better. So yes, it is always important to speak up. You may want to do that privately, because we don't want to make this, that's one of these points coming up, we don't want to make it about shame and blame. We want to make it about creating more inclusive environments. That's the goal here. It is important to personalize your comments, and we talk about this in interpersonal communication all the time. So the recommendation here is to take responsibility for your own feelings in the situation. So rather than blaming the person like you did this, using I language is more likely to create a more inclusive environment, or at least a more positive communication climate, because you're taking responsibility for your own feelings about it. So I feel uncomfortable when people make these types of jokes, for example. That puts the responsibility on you, like for your own feelings about the situation, and you're also letting the person know that you're uncomfortable with what they said. So rather than placing blame, it's more important that you use I language to create a more positive communication climate. And again, less blame on the individual, more about how you feel about how it could impact the LGBTQ community. So you're challenging the behavior, not the character of the person. So there are no character attacks here. And again, it's important to practice this. So you can role play with others. It can feel scary at first, but just thinking back to what we talked about with privilege. So consider your own privilege in these scenarios and what the risk is to you personally. So if it's really just a social risk for you, meaning you're not going to be at risk of losing your job, or that something's going to be harmful to you, then you probably have the privilege to actually speak up about these issues. And the real risk is whether that person's going to like you or not after. And, you know, we're all adults, and if that's the worst thing that's going to happen, then the benefit is probably more impactful for the LGBTQ community than your own personal feelings about it. It also doesn't have to be a big dramatic thing. So it doesn't need to be a fight. It is really, if you're coming from a place of genuinely trying to help others and help others realize the damage that they may be causing, then it doesn't need to be this big dramatic thing. It can really just come from a place of inclusion, and it can be an invitational process. So some inclusive classroom strategies. One is during roll call. One option is to call last names only, and right up front, you can ask students to tell you what their first name is. You can also introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns. So I try to do this at the beginning of every class, every semester, and just say, hi, my name is Dr. Llewellyn, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And what this does is it opens the door for others to introduce their pronouns and to tell the class and to tell you how they identify. You can also display your Ally Pride sticker or your safe space sticker on your office, and you'll get one after this presentation. And again, if it gets taken down or someone does something to it, we'll give you another one. You can include a safe space or inclusion statement on your syllabus, just for students to see that. And I also make it a point at the very beginning of the semester to state that in my class, like, this is a safe space. My office is a safe space. And just making that really clear and setting the expectations right up front sets the tone for the rest of the semester. And you also want to know where to seek LGBTQ+ resources on campus and to be able to provide them as needed for your students. So you may have already encountered this where a student lets you know something personal that's going on in their lives, and you want to have those resources available so you can send them in the right direction.
All right, so now we're going to do some interactive practice. Sorry, I'm like totally blanking on the English language at the moment. So I'm going to give you a link to a Padlet. So I'm actually going to exit out of this. And we're going to, I mean, hopefully the Padlet works. That would be great. And we're going to respond to this, and you can respond anonymously to the Padlet if of course the Padlet allows you to respond to it. Or you can also respond here in the chat. I will leave Jenny in charge of monitoring the chat, and I'm just going to leave a comment so you can all respond. Okay, so the question is, what do you do if, oh, here, let me screen share it for those of you who might not be able to access the Padlet. Okay, so here's our Padlet. So the question is, for all of you, so what do you do if you're talking to colleagues near your office and a young couple, two men walking and holding hands, stop outside a nearby classroom? One tells the other, okay, just come to the cafeteria after class. They peck each other on the lips, and the other says, love you, and walks into the classroom. But one of your colleagues rolls his eyes and performs a vomiting gesture loud enough for the guy leaving to hear it. So as an ally, what would you do? You're welcome to unmute yourself and just say it out loud if you want to, or you're welcome to respond in the chat or also anonymously on the Padlet. Or you can also sign into the Padlet and it would not be anonymously. Someone said, I'd give them a look of clear shock and dismay and say, really? Are you serious? Someone else said, I would tell them that their response to the couple was disgusting and homophobic, and I did not support their views.
There's one in the chat. Ask the guy if he is okay and apologize for my colleague's behavior.
And someone said, call in that colleague and let them know how the response made you feel and how it could make others feel.
There's one from the chat. I would hope that I would apologize to the student and take the offending idiot into my office where I would let him or her know they were wrong.
Someone else said, I would tell them they made me feel uncomfortable by saying that, and then prompt them to consider the impact they are having on the students or people nearby. I love these responses. Someone else said, I would speak with my colleague and question why they would respond that way. To start a dialogue.
Going back to that last one, I think it is, that's a great tactic, asking a question, because it does kind of put the onus on the other person, and then they have to explain why they said something.
And I really like the people who said they would let the student know. I think it must be in the chat because I don't think I'm seeing it here on the Padlet, but that they would let the student know that that they're okay with that student and that this this behavior that your colleague exhibited was not okay. A lot of allies are really quick to let us know that they would definitely talk to their colleague, but a lot of people forget the first part of the scenario where these two people, one of them is leaving in this moment, and that they're going to meet up. So this person who saw the vomiting gesture and who heard it is going to come back and see their sweetie again and let them know that this happened, and that person might then decide that maybe college just isn't the right place for them. Maybe it just isn't safe enough for them and might drop out of college. So it's really important that first, because you can find your colleague again later, where they work, but you don't know that student, so it's really important that as allies that we catch up to that student and say, let the student know, hey, I'm so sorry you saw this. I'm going to go talk to my colleague and make sure that this behavior doesn't happen again. You should not have had to go through that. That's not what we're here. That's not what we're like here at the college. That's not the kind of environment that that we like to uphold here. This is a safe space, and you are welcome here. You are wanted here, and we will deal with this. And then you go back and talk to your colleague, and and I love the suggestion that asking them like a question, opening it up into a dialogue where they you can have an open discussion about this, and maybe they'll learn something from it, but maybe they will hunker down and just absolutely refuse to change their position. Some people, there's just no changing their mind, and so when you start to realize that they're that kind of person, that's where I draw my own personal boundary, and I just give up right there. I did what I should. I let them know what they did was wrong, and if they are that kind of behavior is wrong and the reasons why, and if they're just unwilling to listen to that, to validate that, then I've done my due diligence, and you can't force anyone to to be not racist or not LGBT, not cis heterosexist. We can only do our best. So great responses, everyone. I'm going to move on to the next Padlet. I'm going to put this one in the chat. So what would you do if on the first day of a semester, a student in your class is genderqueer? You can't tell that the student's biological sex, and when calling names for the first time, you accidentally say both their first and last name that's listed on your roster, which is Ashley Williams. And that student asks you to refer to them as Birch Williams. Other students giggle, whisper, and roll their eyes. So as an ally, what would you do? This one's a little bit trickier, huh?
You can also use the chat if you like. Okay.
Someone said, I let my students know before roll call that my class is a safe place and a place where we respect each other. But if after that I have issues, I would gently remind the students of what I had said and that if they wish to be in my class, they must be respectful. I like that.
This comment says, I don't call names, I use a sign-in sheet.
Someone else said, I would remind my class that this is a safe space and that the only kind of behavior towards each other, is appropriate. I would also remind them that we will address all students in the class by what they express that they would like to be called. Someone else said, I would positively acknowledge the name and then remind others that they can request to be called a name other than what is on the roll call sheet. These are good responses.
There's a comment from the chat. Oh, let me scroll up a little bit. I always let students know before taking roll to let me know what they want to be called so I can make a note and that I will do my best to remember. If I mess up, call me out on it because who they are is important. Sorry, I just lost the comment again. I'm a human and I may make mistakes, but I will always make an effort. I also inform students we treat each other the way we want to be treated. No disrespect will ever be tolerated.
I have a great comment here that says, maybe you could say my mistake to the student. I like that because it implies that you made a mistake because you obviously shouldn't be calling first names. And it also, helps not, kind of retract a little bit, accidentally outing that student, because then other students might assume that maybe you just read the wrong name. So I like that. Someone else said, I don't tolerate laughing at students in my class ever. I'd say something like, welcome, Birch. This is a safe and welcome place here. I'm sorry, everyone is safe and welcome here. I'd remind them about my laugh and get kicked out policy. If I was able to pick out which students laughed, I'd hold them after and have a conversation with them about it. Someone else said, I begin with letting students know to let me know what name they prefer to be used and discuss the many reasons why people like to be addressed by preferred name and give examples that are broad and specific. Then I would also discuss how important it is to respect our preferences and our names. Our names and identities are important to all of us. So if that happens, I would let all the students know that it isn't acceptable in my class to disrespect each other. And participation in my class requires respecting each other. These are some great responses. Yeah, so this situation is kind of tricky because you want to address the anti-LGBTQ comments and behavior, but at the same time, you also don't want to call too much attention to that student. You know, we often like to do a learning moment and help people to learn why their behavior is wrong so that they won't do it in the future. But we also have to walk a fine line between like calling too much attention to that student and causing that student to feel like they caused a a scene, and and it's just going on, and like all they want is for everything to just move onward so that they can just go back to being not having the spotlight on them. A lot of trans people, we feel kind of awkward, kind of scared, because we are subject to forms of violence and bullying that other people are not necessarily susceptible to. We have some some extra concerns, and so anyway, yeah, we do have to like kind of toe that line between making sure that behavior stops and establishing your classroom as a safe space, and also moving the conversation on away from the student, but also addressing that behavior. So there's so many different ways to go about it, and there's some great responses to the scenario. So thank you everyone for participating in this one. And we just have one more that we'd like to go over. And yes, I see someone has raised their hand.
I just wanted to say that I have a couple colleague friends that have said to me that their practice is to not call roll at all and to just go around the room and have students introduce themselves, and then they find the person on the roll sheet. And so in the case where you got Birch, and then the last name, you could just say, okay, thank you, and make a note. And if you needed to clarify, like, is that the same person, you could check with the student afterwards. But then they're not having to, like, nobody's feeling awkward. And you can also note things like pronunciation of names, so you're not like butchering first or last names, and so I just thought that was really like a cool suggestion from some of my colleagues, and I thought I'd share it.
Thank you. Absolutely.
That is a great way to do roll. I think it also makes a difference if you are telling them like, okay, I'm gonna write this down. I'm gonna work on learning the correct pronunciation of your name. And at least that's what I try to do with my students. I tell them like, it might take me a couple of days or a little while to get this correct, but I am committed to learning your name. Oh, and someone said the name coach plugin on Canvas could avoid this issue too. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yes. Yeah, if you haven't heard of it, yeah, there is a function where students can actually record how to say their name, and which is a great place for them to tell you also what their name is. And we are working on coming up with a really streamlined process for allowing students to upload their preferred names into our system so that they will start appearing on things like rosters and appear in Colleague and in Web Advisor, Starfish, whatever programs it is that you're using. I'm a budget technician, so I use very different programs than the rest of you. But I've been working on a group that is working to establish a streamlined process. At the moment, we do have a form for students to fill out that does change their name in Canvas. So their Canvas display name will reflect their preferred name. And that resource can be found on the link that I included in the chat earlier on during the break. And then, so they can do that. And then eventually we will, once we've got the process like totally finalized and put it into place, then we will have a process for students to have their names changed everywhere and not just in Canvas. So our next question is, what do you do if one of your students comes to your office hour ostensibly for help on an assignment, but a few minutes in, she starts to tear up and begins telling you how her very conservative parents found out she's gay and in a relationship that she's been hiding. They're threatening to kick her out and stop paying for school if she doesn't change her, quote, lifestyle choice. So what would you do? Someone said that they would listen and ask them if there are ways that they can help. Someone else said they would offer resources on campus. Someone else said, I would express understanding that this is not a lifestyle choice and sympathy that it must be hard to have a family that you may love, but who may be ignorant on this topic. Someone else said, I'd personally connect her with LGBTQ resources on campus and in our community as a whole. I don't feel like I could serve her well on my own. These are great responses. Someone else said, I would listen, just listen and talk them through it. Look for resources together, and most importantly, take the time and make sure they are heard. Very good.
Okay, and this said, I've had this and similar situations come up. It's usually a discussion about how they feel how they feel, what they want to do, suggest alternate resources. Primarily, we have to listen and not judge them or their family.
Yeah, so these are great responses because yes, it's great to listen. That's definitely like the very first thing that we should be doing in this moment is definitely listening, validating, what they're going through, validating their identity, validating this difficulty that they're having to deal with. And then also, yeah, none of us are experts. I'm not even an expert. A lot of times people reach out to me expecting me to just fix everything. And I'm like, well, actually, here's some great resources, people who actually help out people in this situation for a living. So there's so many different awesome resources out there, and you will find them on that website that, like I mentioned before, I dropped into the chat during the break. That web page is just it's something I've been working on for a long time. I maintain it constantly. It's a great resource for finding more resources. Anything that your students could need. There would be more resources on there, but unfortunately, for some reason, every time I try to update the website for those resources specific to trans people, it keeps getting denied. And I'm trying to find out why our administration doesn't want to provide resources to trans students. But otherwise, it's got a lot of other resources for LGBTQ students in general. And there's a lot of great links and things on there. So if you didn't check out that link, please check that out. I'm not seeing any more responses to the Padlet, so I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and switch back over to, yes.
I know that pre-COVID, there was, through psych services on campus, there was an LGBTQ group that met. Do you know if that's still going on?
So it changed. So it is now going on. Again, it's now digital. So if you I haven't seen an email yet for this semester, but last semester, for those of you who were working with Fresno City College last semester, you would have seen, mail all emails that let you know about like what's going on at Fresno City College, during usually it's like a 2-week overview, of all things happening in the next 2 weeks. And if you look through those emails, you would have seen mentionings of an LGBTQ support group for students. and I forget what it's called. It used to be called Rainbow Rams, and I remember it being like called something a little bit different, but still it's basically the exact same thing. I think it's still being hosted by the same person. They do have at least one person working there for psych services who is LGBTQ and who specifically supports students who are LGBTQ. So psych services is a great resource. And then there's also a lot of other great hotlines because psych services is kind of impacted, they've got so many students to serve and nowhere near enough people to actually serve them all in a very in the most effective manner. So I also have some other resources listed on the website specifically for people who are in need, in need of crisis intervention right now. But if there are no other questions at the moment, I just want to, before we close out and answer lots of miscellaneous questions, I just want to remind you all that, please remember to complete your LA agreement and send that back to us so you can receive your sticker. Make sure you send them to me. You can CC Jenny on the emails, but definitely make sure it goes to me because I'm the one with the stickers and who processes those forms. So please send those to me. But if you have any questions at any time, you're always welcome to reach out to myself or also to Jenny at the emails below. And my extension is also down there. And thank you so much for coming to this presentation today and trying to figure out how to make FCC a safer place for everyone.
Where's the agreement?
So it was dropped into the chat. It didn't let me just drop it in as a normal file. I had to do some sort of like iCloud sharing thing in order to make the chat work. This Zoom setup is very interesting.
Should we drop it in there one more time? So
yeah, I can. It will take me some time because it took me literally like the entire 10-minute break to do it because it doesn't let you just upload files like a normal Zoom would do.
You want me to handle that? I'll do that if you want to field some questions for now.
Oh, it's okay. I can do it while doing the questions.
Okay. I'm not good at multitasking at all, so.
I can kind of do it. And we did have a question about all gender restrooms that I will answer because that person's been waiting like almost 2 hours now for that question to be answered. And so yes, we do have all gender restrooms being requested. We have only like 6 all gender restrooms on campus at the moment. And I did author a proposal requesting a lot more. And I submitted that proposal like 2 years ago. And unfortunately, as far as I know, nothing's been done on that one. On the gym shower curtains proposal, which I also submitted around the same time, that one, they kind of moved forward a little bit. They tried something out in the stadium and it's working well. And so they're going to bring that over to the gym here on campus and get some similar types of partitions and curtains in the showering area of the gym here on campus. But as for the all gender restrooms, I haven't really seen anything happening. Every time I ask for updates, I'm not really given a real update. It's just kind of, they just keep telling me that, everything's on hold because of COVID, that they don't have people to work on those things, that they don't have the resources, etc. So it's been just kind of put on hold for a while, and I'm really hoping that our administration actually acts on it at some point. I don't really have the power to force our administration to give us restrooms, but I've made a very strong case, and all I can really do at this point is just keep following up and really pushing for it and demanding that change. I did make an all gender restroom map, and then the campus made a better one, and for some reason hasn't posted it online. So I can send that. They sent me a draft, and I can send that draft to anyone who needs it. But I've been checking in every year, and I'm given a different reason as to why it's not on the website. So unfortunately, it's very unfortunate, but people do have to actually request it from me until they get around to putting it on the website. Do we have any other questions? Someone said, I teach 100% online. Is there anything I can do to ensure LGBTQ students feel seen, accepted, and welcomed? There's so much you can do. Like, first off, anywhere where you like introduce yourself for the first time, make sure you include your pronouns. In your email signature, when you email students, make sure your pronouns are always in your email signature. Um, Introducing your pronouns with your name is like the #1 way to identify yourself as an ally. Whenever I see someone list their pronouns, even though they may, even though I know that that person is not LGBTQ, when I see those pronouns listed next to their name, that's a signal that that person is an ally, and that just seeing that just makes me feel more comfortable, feel like I can just be my true self, I can let go and and be loose and just be my true self around you. If I don't see pronouns next to your name, then for all I know, or at least, something that says no pronouns for people who don't have pronouns. If you don't have anything next to your name like that, then I have to assume that you're not safe, that you may not be an ally. So that's just a real quick, great signal. Because an ally understands that, the importance of not assuming anyone's gender, and that needs to be a part of our culture. So that's like the #1 thing that you can do. And then I think we said before, having an LGBTQ, safe space type of statement in your syllabus, just letting everyone know that, this is a safe place for people of all identities, including but not limited to, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. Just letting people know that they're safe here, and then making sure you actually stick to that. Anytime something arises, make sure you stick to what you said in your syllabus and actually, follow those, disciplines, disciplinary procedures that you mentioned, and also mentioning LGBTQ events as they happen, letting your students know, like, hey, there's going to be an LGBTQ rainbow graduation celebration in May. So if you're graduating this semester or next semester, make sure you reach out to them, and make sure you sign up for that. Here's the flyer, or, hey, Fresno City College marches in the Pride Parade every year. If you want to join them, just message Arian and let them know you want to march with them. To get signed up. Just anytime we anytime of things going on, just pass that on to your students. That's also a great way to let them, to keep being an ally to your students. And there's just so many other different ways that you can be an ally, and it's really, going to be up to your specific circumstances, your teaching style, you specifically. Everyone has a different, unique role to play towards making the world a safer place.
There was a question earlier specifically about inclusive language, like safe space language to include in the syllabus. And to that, I would just recommend doing a Google search, borrowing from other instructors, and then, making it what you think is fit for your own Canvas site or syllabus. I tend to not include these kind of clauses in the syllabus just because I tend to think that students don't really read the syllabus. So I try to put this stuff in places that I know they are need to see on Canvas. So like in my course policies page about classroom dynamics, things like that. So you can find, I think you can crowdsource from the internet to find inclusive language for Canvas and your syllabus if you choose to put it on there.
And someone asked about, because they teach biology, they asked if male and, they say that male, she said that male and female come up a lot, and that she switched to saying biosex. And before, to clarify that she's talking about most of the people who have testes and most people who have ovaries. Is biosex still an okay term to use? Yes, definitely. If you're talking about biological sex, then definitely say, biological sex. If you're talking about gender identity, say gender identity. Just make sure you're using the correct terms, is really important. A lot of people tend to, use gender terms like men, women, when they actually are talking about biological sex, in which case they should be using biological sex terms, male versus female. because those are, sex terms, whereas like man and woman are identity terms. So just making sure you're using the correct terms in those scenarios is very important. And someone said, I'd love to learn to better prepare my pre-allied health students to respectfully engage with LGBTQ patients in the medical field. Do you know of any resources? We do provide public safe space trainings to students, typically well, not just to students, but to everyone. It's public, and we typically do them during LGBTQ History Month. I believe it was the last time we did it. I think that's when we usually do it. So definitely, send those flyers out to the students, because we always send out flyers publicly through PIO. It's on all of our social medias. So just forward those flyers on to your students and say, hey, make sure you attend this so you understand, how to sensitively communicate and work with people who are LGBTQ. So that would be a great way to get started. Beyond that, I'm not sure that I myself do not know of anything specific to the medical field that is going on. And unfortunately, the medical field does have a huge need for more LGBTQ inclusive training practices for people in that field. Someone asked, are there additional resources in regards to Title IX? Are you asking for additional resources that clarify Title IX? I'm a little confused. Well, while that person is clarifying, thank you everyone so much for coming. We're gonna go ahead and close out the session. You're welcome to stay. I know someone messaged me wanting to talk a little bit more after this session, so I'm gonna stay here. But I wish all of you a great rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your sessions, and thank you so much for coming to our session.